And now we'll finish off with Tokugawa Japan. When we look at classical Japan and the way that it is named, usually the title comes from either the family name of the shogun in charge or the capital city uh, where they ruled from, or the palace where they ruled from. So it can get a little bit confusing. These words are used interchangeably, so I'll let you guys know as we move along through exactly what we're talking about. But before we go into Tokugawa Japan, it's important to look at some of the intricacies of Japan, which we'll get more into in class. But we will get into the intricacies that really make it such a unique place. It is an island nation. Um, and because of this, it has a lot of different cultures. It has a lot of different regional eccentricities, a lot of regional differences, and it's never really been a unified country, especially in pre-modern times. There are four main islands of Japan. Up at the top is the island of Hokkaido, and then you have the big island of Honshu. Um, this is Hokkaido, and here is Honshu. And then next you have the Big Island of Honshu, is where most of the culture and society and influence has come from traditionally. And then underneath there you have Shikoku, the smaller island of Shikoku, and then finally down at the bottom you have the island of Kyushu. Now these islands are the big ones. These are the ones that are most known. These are the ones that have the most activity. But you have a lot of smaller islands in Japan. You know, several smaller islands. In fact, I would say there are about 2,456 of them. So these islands, much like the islands of Indonesia, of Southeast Asia, have sometimes you have islands that are big as cities. Sometimes you have islands that are small, that are just basically the size of your neighborhood or something like that. Very, very small islands, but still very regionally different, and a lot of different ideas and a lot of different and diverse origins to people. The people of Japan fall into two different categories when it comes to their ethnic makeup. The first what are known as the Yamato people, and the Yamato people are the uh, more fair-skinned Japanese, and they have their origins in China. Actually, they were the colonists that came over from mainland China or mainland Korea and settled into Japan. If you want to look at a Western, a more Western reflection of this, look at the way that Greek colonists eventually made it to uh, the islands off of Italy and then southern Italy, and ended up beginning and creating the Empire of Rome. So Japanese have that same sort of ancestry, where they're colonists. They were colonists that came over from the mainland, especially from China. Usually, in the this happened in the end of the first last millennia BC. So these are the Yamato people. These are the ones that the more traditional, what we think of as Japanese. But there are also native Japanese people, much darker skin, much much more in that appear more like Aborigines down in Australia. They have that same cultural line from the Aborigines. So tracing migration, you can say that the Aboriginal people from Australia are also connected to the people of Southeast Asia, and by that, and then extending further up into Japan. So they are the natives of Japan. They are known as the Ainu. And the Ainu people are a persecuted minority still to this day. They're sort of seen as unclean and less civilized than normal Japanese people. Japanese people do have a traditional history of treating them in the same way that colonial Australians are going to deal with um, that colonial Australians are going to deal with the Aboriginal people there. So the Ainu, there are such a thing as native Japanese that were there from the basically the Paleolithic, and they are the traditional Japanese, and then up came the Yamato that brought with them a lot of Chinese culture, a lot of Korean culture, and other mainland Asian culture. But one of the things that stayed with the country of Japan that's sort of different from China and from the mainland is the belief in Shinto, and this belief is um, a traditional spiritual belief. It's not really a religion. It is more of a way of connecting everybody and everything to the adherents of Shinto. There is a spirit that connects everything together. There is a spirit. Human beings have a spirit. Rivers have spirits. Forests have spirits. Trees have spirits. Everything has a life force or a spirit. If you want to look at it as a soul, you can do that. Everything has something that connects it to an otherworldly place, and so it is only right to revere nature. Is only right to revere ancestors who never really go away. That they're always connected around. They're always connected and around us. So this is very similar to a lot of traditional Chinese and mainland folk religion. So you can sort of see this connection between the Ainu, the Yamato, and even the mainland Chinese because of this sort of spiritual belief. And most Japanese have some sort of connection to Shinto, as far as like it's more of a cultural religion that it is a what we would define as a formal religion. So everyone sort of has this background belief in the spiritual realm, in some sort of spirit. So that sort of connects everybody in Japan, kind of separates a little bit more from the mainland, where there's less of an influence of this. There's still this influence of traditionalist folk tales and traditionalist folk beliefs, but in Japan there is that underlying current. And so, even though you have some similarities, the fact that you have so many islands, that most of the main islands are separated, and that you have these different ethnic people of ethnic backgrounds that are not really unified. It's very difficult to unify the entirety of Japan, and really you don't see all of Japan unified in any meaningful way until the early modern period, and really overall culture doesn't really change until into industrialization and the modern period. So that's sort of a brief history of Japan, a brief overlook of Japan, and we'll go through this a lot more in class. Okay, so now let's look at where Japan is by the 16th century. As I noted before, the way that you name these different periods in Japanese history is either by the last name of the um, ruling shogun family, or by the palace where they ruled from. And in this case, you have the Ashikaga period that goes all the way into the middle of the 16th century, and sometimes it's known as the Muromachi period. And this is a time of a single family being in charge for almost 250 years, but towards the end of the 16th middle of the 16th century, you see the shogun power waning. You have a lot of feudal rulers beginning to spring up and take umbrage with the power of the shogun. The central power of the shogun begins to vanish, and in because of this, you have the shogun really clamping down on the poor, raising revenue by pushing harsh taxes on the peasants, and then also taking land away from samurai, making it difficult for samurai to actually make a living on their land. And you see a lot of people begin to raise up against the Ashikaga shogunate. This all leads to a the beginning of a phase that is marked by a lot of civil wars, and one of these civil wars is known as the Onin War. And this is a revolt by peasants and samurai who are near the really near the bottom of society at this point, and they are not being paid, or they're being heavily taxed. And masterless samurai with very little power, come together with peasants to rise up against the Ashikaga rulers. And in this time period, you have Kyoto, the capital city of Kyoto, destroyed by these rebels. And really it just escalates from that. The Ashikaga eventually defeats the Onin uprising, taking out most of the samurai, and using terror tactics against the peasants, burning down whole villages, things like that. And eventually within a decade is going to win. However, that just weakens the power of the shogun. And pretty much by 1500, by the time we were looking at the beginning of this class, the country is gripped in several wars as different alliances are being made, and different tribal leaders or daimyo are fighting against one another, looking for control. And so, because of all of this, you'll see the Ashikaga shogunate begin to fall apart. And this whole time period here, from 1465 up until the end, is known as the Sengoku, or the Warring States period. And really, about 1465 is when you start seeing the cracks of it. And then by 1467, you have the Onin War, and that's really the beginning of the end of the Ashikaga period. And you basically had all these different daimyo or tribal warlords trying to one up each other and put someone into power that they could control themselves. And it is actually a family known as the Hosokawa family that puts a a shogun in charge until 1558. So basically, they have an Ashikaga shogun in that's basically a puppet uh, in charge of the country. And I put "in charge" in big quotation marks, because they really didn't have that much control, as there were still a lot of people rebelling against the Ashikaga, and there never really was this complete control. But this all by 1558, the Hasakawa family will lose control of the shogunate. The Ashikaga will fall, and then you will have the rise of what's known as the three great unifiers. And two of these great unifiers control Japan for about 40 years. They are the first and second of the great unifiers. They are of the Oda house here on the right, which is known as the Oda family, and Azuchi house. And then you have the Toyotomi family and the Momoyama house. So those are the two names that you can have: Azuchi, Momoyama, or the Oda and Toyotomi clans. So those are the different ways that you'll see these named. The first of these great unifiers is Oda Nobunaga, and Oda Nobunaga comes into power in about 1568. And at first, it's not direct power. He actually puts in another shogun in charge, the last of the Ashikaga shoguns. And this shogun begins to try and set reforms that would unify the country and quell all of the reasons for rebellion. But these reforms are slow to work, and so often they don't work at all. So by 1573, Oda Nobunaga basically takes charge, and he seizes the imperial capital and replaces the shogun. So 1568 is when he really takes control, but 1573 is where he takes direct power of the shogun, and basically ends the Sengoku period. And so from here, from 1573, you see him consolidating his rule throughout the Central Plains, throughout the central of the main island of Honshu, and actually beginning to move down towards Shikoku. And he really does this by allying with some of the other major players in the civil wars, and using diplomacy as well as military might. However, in 1582, he dies when he is actually betrayed by one of his bodyguards. His bodyguard, Akechi Mitsuhide, is going to basically one day decide, I'm just going to assassinate Oda Nobunaga, and no one really knows why. Um, uh, Nobu Nobunaga basically is defeating his enemies, and he's going to go to a tea ceremony, a holy ceremony at a Shinto temple. And because of this, he only takes with him a few of his bodyguards. He doesn't take his entire army. And it is at that time that you have Akechi Mitsuhide bringing his forces in, surrounding Oda Nobunaga, and basically also staging a coup at Nobunaga's castle at the same time. And as the troops come in, Nobunaga decides to commit seppuku, or ritual suicide, instead of being captured. And he asks his servants to burn his body so that no one may take his head. And so after this, Mitsuhide runs away, and you have Oda Nobunaga's retainers seeking vengeance against Mitsuhide, and the one that does get revenge is the next of the great unifiers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And Toyotomi Hideyoshi uh, defeats Mitsuhide, and Mitsuhide and his forces are completely defeated and destroyed. Within 13 days, his reign is known as the 13-day shogunate, and Mitsuhide, according to the stories, he runs away, and he's actually killed by a famous bandit in the woods. And so he is no longer the shogun. Instead, Toyotomi Hideyoshi takes charge. And Toyotomi is going to continue Nobunaga's policies, and he follows where Nobunaga was going, moving his power base down into Shikoku and Kyushu, basically creating more of a power base, and unifying the three big islands, as much as he can. And because of his closeness to Nobunaga, the Oda clan has lost its leader, and even Nobunaga's son was killed in this. And so the Oda submit to the Toyotomi clan, and all the other daimyo accept his authority as basically Nobunaga's second in command. By 1588, he collects the swords of the other daimyo, basically melting them down um, melting them down and taking them away. So basically, the other daimyo say that no one will take up arms against Toyotomi. And by 1591, you see Toyotomi beginning to create this new government, a much more modernized government. But is a government that is completely under the control of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. So after this, Hideyoshi has basically taken control of Japanese government, and really is looking to see how to further consolidate his power and further get the people behind him. And the way that he does this is by invading the mainland, specifically Korea. And these battles stay. Occur from 1592 to 1598 with the invasion of what is now South Korea down here from Japan. These wars basically end in a stalemate. Um, in 1596, you have a treaty that's supposed to last 5 years. It actually only lasts 2 years, and then you have a another invasion in 1598 to 1601, and this is actually a war where the Ming Chinese get involved, since by this point Korea is under the control of the Ming, and so you have the Ming in China and the Toyotomi shogunate in Japan, fighting it out against one another. The two main forces that have struggled and ended up on top now need a common enemy, and they fight against one another, and it eventually just ends in a stalemate. But the aftermath of this is very, very important, because this is actually the first modern war in the Pacific, and it will be a model for Pacific wars later on, as the clans as the forces fight. They take over islands, and they basically set up these strongholds filled with men with guns, and then on the mainland they basically uh, create snipe what will become like basically snipers nests. So whenever you're an invading force through the water, you will be met with the hail of gunfire, and if you're trying to go from island to island, you will usually be met by forces that are stationed in all these individual islands. So as you can see here in South Korea, you have a ton of these little islands, and having to fight your way through all of these islands makes it very difficult for the Japanese to really make any headway. And this is the way that wars will be fought in the Pacific from here on out. This does weaken the Toyotomi clan. The Toyotomi clan gambled that this would be an easy victory, and that the people of Japan would rally around them, and they would have a stronghold in China, and they would eventually be able to move and take more land on the mainland. But this backfires on them with um, uh, this stalemate, and so the Toyotomi clan then uh, is going to instead be weakened by this, and will eventually be their downfall. Speaking of downfall, the Ming are also weakened, and this actually leads to their downfall, having to spend so much money and so much in defense of the people of the north of Korea. And the people in the north of China, they begin to sort of say, well, these people are on their own. We can't afford to spend up money on this. And so whenever more nomadic fighters are coming in the north, the Manchu are sort of left on their own because of the costliness of this war. The Ming aren't really looking to spend money to defend them, and this will eventually lead to the Manchu rising up and marching south against the Ming, and overthrowing them eventually. So actually at the beginning of this second invasion, it's pretty clear that the Korean forces, the Ming forces, and the Japanese forces are not going to have a significant victory. There's no one is going to win out of this one, and so this weighs heavily on Hideyoshi, and so uh, the weight of all of this is eventually going to weaken him and actually kill him. And his death is actually kept hidden for over a year before it's actually stated that he has died. And after his death, there's infighting among his generals on who will be the who will take charge, but pretty much no one can stop the next shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Ieyasu is going to lead the new country, this new shogunate, to take over all of Japan, and really creates the most powerful and longest lasting of all of these Japanese shogunates. Tokugawa actually forbids any sort of military retaliation uh, against the Chinese, and signs a treaty, and basically closes off Japan to the mainland for a long time. It's not until later after his death that you really see it open up. So this is known as the Great Peace of the Tokugawa period, and so here during this time period, also known as the Edo period, or Edo period, because of that's where his main palace was in Edo. You have what's known as the Great Peace, where he rules through a coalition of daimyo and council elders. So basically, you have the emperor up at the top, who's basically a figurehead as our court nobility, and it's really the shogun that's in charge. And daimyo and samurai act as the ruling class. And so he's able to set national policy on behalf of the emperor, and he governed his own domain while also setting policy for the other daimyo. And for the One of the things that he would do is he would actually compel the daimyo to maintain two residences, their own domain and a capital at or a palace in Edo. So the daimyo would have to spend money on both their home residence and the residence at Edo, and they would spend half their time in the imperial stronghold at Edo, and half their time back home. And at this time, you see samurai becoming less and less of warrior classes, and more of a salaried class, and they basically were no longer these warriors of old. Um, they were much more of these um, landed gentry, salaried officials. Just basically, the old system was beginning to be put to pasture. That the Edo time period basically brings about the end of the samurai as a warrior class, and the beginning of more of a noble class of men. Now, the Edo period was also a time of transformation for Japan as a whole, as you start seeing the beginnings of the seeds of capitalism go through Japan. You see industry and trade begin to grow as it's stimulated by the continued work of the Tokugawa shoguns, and this really led to a rising standard of living. You have banking flourishing throughout the Edo period um, as coinage and use of precious metals and stones began to be uh, overtaken by the use of paper money and banknotes, and so this became the norm throughout the nation, and a merchant class really begins to emerge after all of the years of wars and the different struggles that Japan had seen. All of a sudden, now you're seeing a lot more stability thanks to the Tokugawa, and so this allows for trade to flourish throughout Japan, and a merchant class really begins to emerge as more and more people can afford to buy fine goods for their homes, and ways um, and have ways to spend their money. However, not everyone really benefited from this new capitalism. There were a lot of unemployed warriors or ronin that went through the land. Some of them becoming mercenaries, some of them becoming bandits, some of them becoming homeless, and just sort of being around without a war to fight. Remember, you'd had all these years of war throughout the end of the Ashikaga and the Sengoku period. But now you had the end of that, and the end of all that warfare led to the end of the need for all of these fighters. So you had a lot of unemployed warriors that became an issue. And outside of that issue, you also had land problems. As you had more and more trade, as you had more and more people that were needed to be fed, you began to see problems with the land in Japan as peasants continued to rely on rice cultivation, and there were more peasants. There were more need for rice cultivation. Not really a lot of innovations coming forward. So with the rising, because of that, there was a rising cost of rice. There was a lot of taxes leveled against rice growers, and so this led to a lot of revolts among farmers and among peasants themselves. Now, societally, the life in Edo, Japan, really was centered around the village. Uh, there was an increase in government power as there were governmental decrees on all aspects of lives as the Edo government began to give more autonomy to the local daimyo. You had the local daimyo really having a lot of control over each different region, and so the daimyo became very powerful when it came to their own region. However, as far as being able to control the entirety of the nation, they never really had any sort of power. So they had to fuel their ambitions into their own local towns, villages, and farms. And so the daimyo had a lot of autonomy and a lot of free reign to govern all aspects of life in these villages. However, you do see more of a modernization, the um, end of multi generational homes, and really the emergence of the nuclear family happens here in the um, in the Edo period, going into the times past. So you see the beginning of more of a westernized view of the family, and actually the beginnings also as time goes on of Western culture and Western clothes. The role of women actually becomes more restricted during this time, especially in the samurai class. The samurai class, women begin to be seen as possessions, or as trophies to be seen and shown in this ruler and warrior class. Women are not really allowed to have any real autonomy over themselves. There's a lot of arranged marriages during this time, and intermarriage among the four main classes is pretty prohibited, and that is the four main classes that you find in Edo society are Shi no Kosho, Shi is the warrior ruler class, No are the peasants, Ko are the artisans, and Sho are the merchants. So you have warriors, peasants, merchants, and artisans are the four main classes, and people from these different class groups didn't really intermarry. It was a taboo. You really didn't have a lot of upward mobility for women, whereas men could probably move up within their class structure, but that was about it. Now, there was another class of outcasts, and those were known as the Eta. A lot of these were women that had children out of wedlock. So women who had children out of wedlock, their children, women that children that had come back from war, half mixed children of Koreans or Chinese. You had the Ainu also seen as Edda. So there were these four main classes, but there was also a class of outcasts in Edo, Japan. Now, culturally, this is pretty much a boom for the country of Japan. You start seeing this new urban fiction that takes hold. So these stories with illustrations within them, the beginning of Japanese manga and what will later become anime, actually has its beginnings in Edo culture as illustrations and words begin to really intermix. You see the beginning of this in early Edo, where it's very similar to Victorian type novels, where you have loads of writing and then an illustration that relates to what's being said. But then later on in Edo period, you have the illustration and the words actually mixing together. So this is a really new urban type of urban fiction, as it's known, because uh, it really took hold in the cities versus in the rural areas. You also have the rise of kabuki theater and outlandish spectacle theater. So the exaggerated plays that we'll look at in class. The rise of this type of theater that emphasizes drama and is very loud and very colorful, and it's really made for the people. However, a lot of traditional Japanese culture was also saved during this time, thanks to someone known as the traveling folklorist known as Basho. He or a group of he's uh, that wrote in the name Basho basically saved traditional Japanese poems and Japanese stories and put them to illustration and sort of kept them preserved in a book, much like the Grimm brothers in Europe. Artistically, you see this as the time where painting, architecture, textiles, ceramics flourished throughout Japan. You have the most famous of the Japanese paintings built around this time. Everything sort of focusing on nature and beauty and the uniqueness of Japan, especially with things like Mount Fuji there. There was, as the West begins to encroach on Japan, Edo culture really takes to liking the uh, um, Western forms of art. There is this passion for what's known as Dutch learning or Europe becoming more Europeanized. There is this passion for looking at European art and really Um, uh, making it their own in this regard. There's a lot of mass-produced woodblock prints, like the ocean wave there up top, but also a lot of European-inspired prints are being made. So you have these large-scale, mass-produced wooden prints that are being made and sent out, not only throughout Japan but also back towards the West. And speaking of the West, the Tokugawa time period is when you start seeing the opening of the West, and of course, the first one of the first people that are in Southeast Asia, the first people that are in China, and now the first people that are in um, Japan are the Portuguese. The Portuguese come to Japanese ports and they begin to sell off their goods. And the Japanese are uniquely fascinated by European goods, uniquely fascinated by European art, and they begin to be fascinated, especially by weapons and armaments. These weapons and armaments that can be used in great effect against their enemies. So with the weaponry available, with the goods that are available by the Europeans, they begin to allow Europeans to come into Japan. And once this happens, you start seeing the first of the missionaries come in, and we'll discuss this gentleman here during class. But missionaries converted the daimyo, and the daimyo went out and proselytized, and the missionaries then began to destroy local artists, local idols and shrines, things that they saw as demonic and things that might have worked in the Americas, where many of their enemies were dying off in droves because of their diseases. But here in Japan, it was not as easy for them, and they began to be expelled. From Japan, the Tokugawa ordered the eviction of all missionaries and begins a persecution of Christians, where Christians have to hide in their homes. And actually, there is a case of the 27 martyrs, I believe it is, where 27 Christian Catholic Christians are told to get out. They don't, and they end up being crucified in Japan, and this leads to the West being much more antagonistic against the Japanese. But this persecution continues on into the 19th century, and Christians are forced to hide. These tabernacles in their homes and worship together in secret, and many of them actually carry around this coinage that you see in the lower right. That's basically about the size of a person's thumb and is held inside their pocket as sort of a way to be able to pray. And so this persecution is one of the things that's going to really sour the West on Japan. But this leads to Japan also souring itself on the West, and authorities begin to really regulate foreign threat a very similar way to the way that China regulates their trade through the Canton system. The Tokugawa will regulate their trade with the Sokoku system. And so Japan itself will ultimately close itself off from the West, not really move forward with any sort of trade or any sort of exploration or anything with the West. They are leaving China alone as far as militarily, and no longer really interested in taking parts of the mainland, and so they have become isolated themselves. And there you go. This is where we end the first part of the class. In this time period where China has become isolated from the West, where Japan has actually blockaded people away from their ports. You have the Middle East turned against themselves. You have Africa being increasingly under the power of European forces. And so there is really no one left to stop the march of Europe towards the Americas, and really towards the domination in the Pacific and Indian Ocean as well. So after this point, you start seeing more of a focus on the West, because it is the West that is the dominant force in the world. But what happens here at this time is that China, Japan, Middle East, they don't just stop. They don't just stop moving. Things are going to be the passage of time is going to give them more power throughout the years and throughout the centuries that will show up in other ways that we'll get to later on. So let's not think that China, Japan, and the rest of the world doesn't matter, even though here in the next part of class, we'll be focusing in a lot on the West and a lot on Western culture. So after this next class period, we will have our first exam, and then we'll be moving over towards the new world, the colonies of the new world, and the changes in Europe as well, going into the 17th and 18th centuries. But that will be for the next class period. Here this week, we'll be looking a little bit more into the grandeur of Ming and Qing China and the grandeur of the Tokugawa era Japan. So I'll go ahead and sign off, and I will see you all in class.